In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. S praznikom. Happy feast. Today we celebrate our patron saint, St. Herman of Alaska. So not only with the festal liturgy, then we'll have festivities after with lunch. And so it's a wonderful thing to celebrate a patronal feast day. It's kind of like a mini Pascha, in fact. And so the church, the feast day, it actually bumps whatever else is supposed to be commemorated that day, then there's a feast, and there's whatever. But it's a time to give thanks to God for our community, to give thanks to God for the parish, and to especially pray for one another in this community as we support one another in our common Christian life. So St. Herman of Alaska was one of the original missionaries from Vallam in 1793. They left from Vallam, which is a great monastery on the Vallam archipelago in Lake Ladoga, which is north of St. Petersburg, about 150 miles or so. They were chosen especially in a cooperative venture between the Russian-American company, which handled the fur trade, and the government the imperial government in St. Petersburg. And so 10 missionaries were chosen. St. Herman was chosen not because he was a priest or a deacon, not because he was any kind of clergy, but rather because of his profound spiritual maturity, where he became the spiritual foundation for the mission. On Vallam, he had lived as a hermit in his own little hut, about a mile or so away from the main complex. I've been to that place many times, in living as a hermit, he would live as a hesychast, essentially, with a focus on the Jesus prayer. And then he would go into the main monastery for Sundays and for all of the big feast days. But primarily, he was in his hut, in his little house, on the edge of a field. And so it was a big change for him to accept to go out as a missionary all the way to America, to Kodiak Island. It took them almost a year to walk across Asia. Of course, they walked. They took boats. They took carts. Because they had a whole lot of stuff. St. Herman, for example, brought a copy of the Philokalia. In Russian, it's called the Dobrotolubi, which means the love of the good. Of course, that volume it's about double the size of an old telephone book. There are some people here that remember what telephone books are, I think. And it weighed about 40 pounds. You can see it in the archives up in Kodiak, and handle St. Herman's own copy in Slavonic. And this is basically a guide to hesychast life, how to live a life focused on the Jesus prayer. St. Herman got to it took them a year to get, almost a year to get to the east coast of Asia, where they got on a boat and went by ship for the rest of the couple thousand miles that it took to get to Kodiak. And when they got to Kodiak, they found a pile of lumber on the shore, and that was to be their church and monastery. Well, so they got to work, and they built the church, and they built the monastery, and with 10 men, it was a doable thing. And they began to set up normal monastic life on Kodiak, and that that monastery, the monastery of the Resurrection, and the Church of the Resurrection, which is still there, became the center for mission. Now, there were 3 or 4 priest monks who were with the fathers there, and they went out all over Alaska, all various directions. Most of them came back. One of them did not. He suffered martyrdom all the way on the coast of the Bering Sea, among the Yupiks. Saint Juvenali, one of the first martyrs of America. In the meantime, there was a couple of priest monks who were assigned to the church in Kodiak to keep the services going, to keep the liturgy going, and to provide all the various needs of the people who came, the Russian fur traders and the settlers and of course the Native Americans, who were the actual focal point of the mission. The mission was sent to bring orthodoxy to America. It didn't matter that the people spoke Yupik and Aleut and Tlingit and Athabaskan, all these native languages, because they were Americans too. And so the mission had a good start, but then the monks noticed, and the people finally, once they trusted the monks, complained that the Russians were maltreating them. The native peoples were being abused by these Russian fur traders, who were a rather, shall we say, rough bunch of guys. And so the monks went on strike, and they would do no services, no baptisms, no weddings, no funerals, no nothing for the Russians. And they sent one of their number to St. Petersburg to make a report. St. Herman did not like all of that kind of politics and chaos. And so he withdrew to an island across the bay between Kodiak City on Kodiak Island and Spruce Island, about 7 miles. This time of year, the sea is like glass, and so it's a very easy passage. But the other half of the year, the other 2/3 of the year, the sea is not exactly like glass. It gets waves 20, 30, 40 feet tall, and obviously you can't take a rowboat through that. So once he was on the island, he was pretty much there to stay, except for very few parts of the year. And he built a little house, just like he had at Valon, and he continued his hesychastic life. His life focused on the Jesus Christ. But in addition to that, he ministered to the local people. He loved the children. He ministered to the orphans and to the widows, to the aged, and especially he ministered to those who became ill. As in many other places in the Americas, when European or American ships would dock, they would always bring contagion. They would always bring some kind of plague. Often those epidemics would kill 30-40% of the village. Can you imagine this happening? And every year or so, another 30% of the village would get would die in the epidemic. So there were lots and lots of orphans and widows. So St. Herman took care of them. He was famous for making them cookies. But he also, he taught them Russian, he taught how to read and write, he taught the people, especially the children, everything that they would need to survive in the society, in this Russian-American society. St. Herman was also known for his, not only for his compassion, but for some miracles. Once there was a major earthquake, and the people were all fleeing up to the higher ground, but he took an icon from the little chapel and put it on the sand and said, "The wave will come no further than this." And so it happened. He also worked fighting forest fires. He did all sorts of other things, invoking the blessing of the Mother of God, and there was with great success. And he died at the end of November in 1837. But being the end of November, they were unable to get a priest there for over a month. So the actual date of his death is November 27th. But the church commemorates him also as his main feast day on December 25th, which is the 12th, according to the old calendar. That's the day of his funeral. St. Herman has been known for many miracles, healings, visitations. We're blessed to have a relic. I think it's probably this bone from his hand for all of us to venerate, and it's fragrant. But I'd also like to say about St. Herman, especially in relationship to the gospel reading today, of that Jesus wanted to go off and pray by himself, so he dismissed the crowd and went up into the mountains by himself to pray. And the day went on, and evening came, and his disciples had already started rowing back to the other side of the lake. And so in the dark, Jesus began walking across the lake. And so when they saw him, they were afraid. Now, the lake at that time was in the middle of a storm. And so there were big waves and wind, and so the apostles were, not only did they see this spirit, they thought, walking across the lake, but they were afraid for their lives because of the storm. And so Jesus, says, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And Peter said to him, "Lord, if it's you, let me come and let me walk across the water to you." And so Jesus says, "Come." And so Peter stepped out of the boat in the middle of the lake and began to walk across the water towards Jesus. And he became afraid, and he began to sink. Jesus reached out his hand and pulled him up and saved him. And told him, "Peter, have faith, have faith." His faith had failed. Now, you know what? It's my turn. So, think about what faced St. Herman. Going from a life of absolute stillness on Valon to march across all of Asia, Northern Asia, that's the long way, you know. Isn't it like stepping out? Think of the kind of courage it took to enter onto into an expedition like that. There were no roads. There was almost no civilization. Asia was, especially northeastern Asia, was either uninhabited or basically there were wild tribes. There were no cities, no towns. And so they made their way all the way across, thousands and thousands of miles, only to get on a boat in the North Pacific, which is seldom very, very still, and especially towards the Asian coast, where it gets hurricanes and all sorts of storms. Think about what it was to finally come to the city, little town, 300 or 400 people, to the place where they were to build this monastery, and instead of finding buildings, they found a pile of lumber. Then think about what it would be to be sent to bring the native people there to Christ, only to find one's own fellow countrymen bitterly abusing them. St. Herman had some huge challenges put before him. And yet, he was able to maintain his inner stillness. To not get pulled into all of the politics, to not get pulled into all of the personal dramas that were going on, especially with all the abuse going on, but to maintain his peace. It's because of this that St. Herman was not only the last of the missionaries. In fact, he lived for over 20 years without any other Russian European missionaries. And remained faithful. He remained faithful not with the support of monastic brothers, not with the support of clergy. I don't know how often he was able to receive communion, because he wasn't a priest. So think of the sacrifice that he made. Think of the courage he had to have. Think of the incredible amount of energy it must have taken to walk across Asia and then go and build a monastery and then his own cell in the wilderness. The work of mission, of which St. Herman is the ultimate example for us. True, he wasn't going out and preaching and baptizing and things and like the missionaries who were priests. But his example endures to this day, and people speak of him in the present tense. St. Herman did this, St. Herman did that, St. Herman is. So first, being members of a church dedicated to him. We have him as our patron, and we can always run to him and ask him for his help, for his guidance, and especially for his love. Because that was the most important means by which St. Herman spread the gospel. He loved those people. He loved the people who were hurting. He loved the people who were orphans or widows, and he did his best to care for them. His preaching of the gospel was may or may not have been in words. I'm not sure how much of the native languages he learned. But he manifests the love of Christ through his actions. This is the real Orthodox way of spreading the gospel. And that model of sending a monastic community out into the wilderness is the ancient model of mission in the Orthodox world, both East and West. The same method of mission was used by St. Patrick in Ireland. It was used to bring the gospel across all of Europe, across Asia, into Africa, everywhere the gospel has gone. And the Russians brought it also to Alaska in the 18th century. So let us emulate that self-sacrificial love that St. Herman showed by manifesting the love of God for all those whom he encountered, by serving them with joy and serving them with faith, that his faith might be contagious. So also may God grant that our faith, our love, and our peace be contagious to a people who are lost in their passions.